So now let's switch gears and talk about taking our first initial Windows form application and adding multiple forms to the application. This is a pretty common task that you'll want to do because if you don't, then you'll end up with an application with one single form, and sometimes that gets a little complicated. So the idea here is that we're actually going to delegate functionality to different forms. So basically think of it as if there's a particular task that I want to do, or if there's a particular view that I want to show, I want to create a separate form for that purpose. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to take the functionality of adding a product to my order and I want to make that a separate form. So to add an additional form to your application, you'll just simply click on the project. You can right click and then choose add and choose new item. The new item dialog will appear, and what we're looking for is an option that says Windows Form. Call this the Add Item to Order form. Now that name may seem a little overly elaborate, but it's good to make sure that your form names are specific. You don't want them to simply be Form 1 and Form 2, because as you incorporate more forms, it's just helpful to know what the purpose of each form is. So that'll be our form. We can do the same as we did before. We can resize this, we can pull up our toolbox, we can add different controls and buttons to it. I'm going to go ahead and just migrate all of these buttons in text boxes for now. I'm going to just simply do a cut, and I'll do a paste and drop them in, and we'll be doing some additional work, but that'll just be a good starting point for this form. Now, as part of the execution of this, what we're going to want to do is we want to make sure that we have our data models in place to be able to share data between these two forms. Now, when we started creating the project last time, we ended up creating two models, sales order and sales order item. In a previous lecture, we had gone through and set up a use case scenario for this application and created an outline of our models. So the sales order and sales order item are fairly similar to the order and order item that we came up with when we were building our use case doc and fleshing out our business models. So we'll go ahead and we can actually finish filling those in. We're just going to slide this to the side, and I'm going to open up sales order first. And I'll tuck it over to this side of the screen. So we'll kind of just split the screen in half and go through and make sure we have all of the pieces lined up. So with the order, first thing I need is a list of order items. And I have that here in this property called items. So I'm going to move that to the top. We then need a subtotal. And right now we have a calculate total method, which does not incorporate things like subtotal or tax. So we can go ahead and do a public float, and we can do get subtotal, and we'll make that an actual method instead of a property. And in here we'll throw a new not implemented exception for now, and that'll remind us that if we program past that, we need to go back and actually implement that method. And then we'll need tax, so we can do public float calculate tax, and then I'm going to take in a float, which will be the interest rate, and then I'll throw that same not implemented exception, and we'll just go back and we'll actually code those out later. So let's see what else we have. Final total, so our calculate total currently is here. Let's look at this. It looks like this is actually going through and doing the work of calculating the subtotal. So I'm going to take that code and move it to calculate subtotal, because that's actually what we're going to do there. And then this will then it'll do two things. It will do get subtotal plus calculate tax. And then we'll need the interest rate, or not the interest rate. I should actually call this the tax rate. So we'll call it tax rate here, call it tax rate here, and we'll need that same tax rate variable here. So we'll take that and we'll return those values. And then we'll need to be able to process a payment and get back the change. So we can do public void add payment. And what this method would do is it would actually take the payment information and save it. And that will come in as a float as well. And we'll throw that same not implemented exception. And this method actually won't return a void, it'll return our change amount, so this float will represent our change. All right, so we've now fleshed out those pieces. And we have additional information in here, such as an order number. So what I typically like to do is I like to take my properties and move them to the top or the bottom. It doesn't really matter which. But I like to move them so that they're kind of in little segments together. And I'm going to go ahead and actually shorten this order created. I'm going to turn it into just an inline initializer. So let's go ahead and look at sales order item. With sales order item, we kind of roughed it out last week and really just matched up our text boxes with our property names. So we have things like product name, price, and quantity, and then we have a toString method. But if we look at our order item, we came up with a slightly different model. We decided that we needed a product property, and that product property would go back to the product class that we're going to create. We would have a quantity property, and then we'd have a line item total, and that line item total would be calculated based off of the unit price of the product and its quantity. So let's go ahead and kind of work toward that. Now, in order to get there, we're going to actually have to stop and create another model. So right click on models, add another class, and I'm going to add a class called product. Now, just as a reminder, this models folder was something that I chose to create. I right-clicked on my project, chose add new folder, and it's just a way for me to keep my project organized. So I created a product class inside of my models folder. So I'll go ahead and make this class public. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in all of these properties here. So we'll start with a string for the product name. We'll do a string for the UPC code, a string for the description, and then we'll do a float for the unit price. So that will represent a product. So we can create multiple instances of this class and populate it with data, and then each one of those objects, those product objects, will then represent a different product. So now if we go back to sales order item, I'm going to start by actually just clearing out everything that's here. So I'm going to start with a property, which will be product, and I'm going to call it product. So this line may look a little confusing, but what's happening here is we have a public property, the variable or the property name is product, and it's of type product. So that's the actual type of data that this variable or property will hold. And then we'll want to go ahead and do quantity. So we'll do prop int, and actually we'll do an unsigned int, and we'll call it quantity. And then the line item total, and this will be a read-only property. Now to do this, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to take and return a calculated value, which will be the quantity times the product unit price. So we're going to take the quantity of the of the sales order item, and we're going to take the product that was stored in the product variable and then grab its unit price and then perform our calculation based on that. So this will then calculate out the total for this. Now, since we now have line item total, I'm going to jump back to sales order because I can actually make some adjustments here. My subtotal originally was going through and doing that calculation for me. It was going through and saying, I'm going to take the quantity of an item times its price. Well, now we can simplify this, and we can simply say, take that item, these items being the items, the sales order items in this order, and I'm just going to take the line item total because the line item total is calculated based on the product and the quantity. So if we end up changing up how we're calculating line item totals, we can simply make the change within the sales order item class, and the sales order function that uses the line item total will be affected based on how we're doing the calculation in the other routine. So now that we have our model set up, we'll be able to move forward in splitting our functionality for our POS application.